We're going to continue on our study of Paul's journeys. You might want to get your Bible and turn to Acts chapter 21. We'll begin in verse 15 and go to the end of that chapter. Now, there's so many things taking place here. And in order to understand what we're about to read, we really need to kind of understand some of the background currents of what all is going on. And there's a lot going on, and we'll be adding to this as we go. But Paul's been having a prosperous journey. I showed you some of the pictures last Sunday night of some of the places he had sailed. It was just unspeakably one of the most beautiful parts of the world to go across those Greek islands and then to make his way from there over to Cyprus and then into Tyre and then coming down to the port there at Caesarea. And so there's the beauty of the journey. There also must have been much in Paul's heart that just filled him with joy as he saw the results of his work. It's almost like a farewell journey to Paul, and he's finding Christians all along the way that results from the work that he has been doing. And in a part, they're very encouraging and accommodating, and they just love him. But then there's an ominous part to this. Everywhere he is going, they're telling him, Paul, don't go to Jerusalem. There's problems await you there. And remember how Agabus said, you're going to be bound hand and foot there in Jerusalem. You're going to be bound with chains. And Paul says, don't weep and break my heart. I'm ready not only to go to Jerusalem, but to die there for my Lord's sake. And so there's that ominous thing going on. There's something else that's going to play into this. The relationship between the Jews and the Romans had been steadily deteriorating. It would not be many years after what we're about to read now where it's going to boil over and there's going to be war between the Jews and the Romans. It's going to begin with Jews against Jews. And then the Romans will be brought in, and it'll be Jews against Romans. And in the end, everything is going to be destroyed. Not one stone left on another in Jerusalem, including all this beautiful temple grounds. And when that occurs, it's going to be the end of all the services of the temple, the end of the priesthood, the end of the sacrifices. These things are all going away. And the church is in a time of transition. Now, we're going to get into this a little further. I'll go ahead and mention it now. There had been much dispute in that early church about Judaism. Can you become a Christian without becoming a Jew? And Paul had been going among the Gentiles teaching them, no, you cannot bind Judaism on these Gentiles. But not much had been said about the Jews and their relationship to the law. It is clear that the Gentiles did not have to follow the law of Moses. But what about these Jews? They had done this all their life. Are they just to forsake everything about the law of Moses? It wouldn't be many years for that would be a moot question. And some suggest, well, this is a time of transition for them. And so they're Christians, but they're bound traditionally to rituals and customs of the law that they're having a hard time pulling away from. God is being gracious as he allows them to mature and realize they don't need to be doing that anymore. And then, like I say, before long, it won't even be a question because that won't be possible. Now, there's something else going on here. With all of that, Paul is bringing money that he had collected from the Gentile Christians and bringing that money to the Jewish Christians. And there was a very much uneasiness between those two cultures. You remember it at Ephesus. All it took was someone to say, he's a Jew, and they yelled out, great is Diana of the Ephesians, for the space of 2 hours. And something similar is going to happen in Jerusalem. Now, when they say that Paul's been among the Gentiles, something similar is going to happen there. And so that tension is strong, and it has to do with members of the church. Christians who are Gentiles and Christians who are Jews. Now, you know, a gift opens a heart. And so Paul had been among the Gentiles collecting this money. He's going to bring it from the Gentiles to the relief of the Jews in Jerusalem. And he's wondering, are they going to receive it? He had asked the Romans, when he wrote the book at Rome, to pray for him that they would receive this at my hand. And so there was some of that doubt and tension there as well. And I also want you to think about Paul's emotions coming to Jerusalem. There had been so many things that had been associated with that city in the life of Paul from the time he was a young man. How it must have been a thrill to go to Jerusalem, be educated at the feet of Gamaliel. He's going to be in that temple where he was, where they dragged Stephen out and stoned him to death. He's going to be there where the Lord spoke to him and told him he needed to leave because his life was at stake. And so that's when he went and left Jerusalem and went up to Tarsus. And so every time he had come to Jerusalem, it had been a very emotional experience. Now he's going back to that city again. And he loved his Jewish brethren. So think of all this going on in the background as we begin to read the events of what happens as Paul makes his way to Jerusalem. Now let's begin. After those days, we took up our carriages and went up to Jerusalem. I want you to look that up to Jerusalem. I'm going to show you something in just a moment that really impressed me. But they're preparing for their journey. They took up their carriages. You think, well, they've got their bags ready. You know, they also had to be mentally ready and get their spirits ready for what they were about to do. Well, there went up with us also certain of the disciples of Caesarea. Now, that's where the port was, where Paul had come. So he's going up to Caesarea, and there's this elderly man. The M is silent, Nason. He was of Cyprus, an old disciple, one with whom we should lodge. And it's a little difficult to follow Nason. Did he come from Jerusalem to Caesarea to accompany them back to Jerusalem? It's about 60 miles from Caesarea Maritima to Jerusalem. It would take more than a day's journey, either one or maybe two, or it would take one or maybe 2 nights to get there. But this man is going to be their host and issuing them. It would be hard to find places of lodging in Jerusalem during this feast period when there were so many there. And so he has got a special mention here. And then when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And I want you to feel Paul's relief for the brethren to receive him gladly, with him not really knowing what kind of reception he might get when he came to Jerusalem. Now it says they went up to Jerusalem. This is the road up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. This is about halfway up. I want you to notice the hilltops in the distance. Jerusalem is up there on those hilltops. I mean, I was kind of taken back at the height of those hills. They're just, it's kind of like going up to Ben Lomond here. I mean, you're going up, up, up to get to Jerusalem. And so when it says they went up to Jerusalem, they're going into those hills, and that gives you some idea of the hill country into which they are traveling. Now, there's Caesarea. There's Jerusalem, the 2 arrows, about 60 to 70 mile journey that they made. And we're going to note the places. Jerusalem, Caesarea, Cyprus. And let's go on with this story. The people. We've got Nason, the old disciple that is mentioned there. And the day following, Paul went with us unto James and all the elders. You remember James? James is the brother of our Lord. He did not believe Jesus was the Christ while Jesus was alive. But after he rose from the dead, he was among those that were in the upper room, awaiting that day when the Holy Spirit would come upon the apostles, and he was praying. And he came to be a man of great note among the disciples in Jerusalem. Traditions assigns him a note that is greater than he would have scripturally been able to bear. They call him the Bishop of Jerusalem. He is mentioned here with the elders, so he's one of the bishops. He's one of the elders. He was one that spoke up when Paul said, let's go to Jerusalem and settle this matter about the Gentiles. James was one of those that spoke up about that. When Peter was released from prison and he was going to depart, he said, now you go tell James what had happened to me. It wasn't James the apostle, because he had been beheaded. It would have been James, the Lord's brother. He's the one that wrote for us the book of James that we read in our Bible. And so he comes back, and James, prominent among the members there at Jerusalem, and when it mentions him with the elders, that's usually how he's mentioned. Remember, when he went to Jerusalem, they went to see the apostles and elders. And so there was Peter and James, one of the apostles, one of the elders there. Well, James and all the elders were present. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord. Again, wouldn't that have been quite a meeting to go to have sat down and heard Paul tell, this is what God has been using me for as I've carried the gospel to the Gentiles, and the great success story he could tell about how the Gentiles are receiving the gospel. And so they glorified the Lord. Now, usually, when you're talking about the Lord in the New Testament, you're talking about Jesus, the Lord Jesus Christ. So as I get to these people, I should have put persons up there too. Now we've got Nason, James, God, and the Lord. But then continuing, they said unto him, thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they're all zealous toward the law. Jewish Christians, they were believers, but they were holding on to the customs of the law. Now, we have to step back and think, this must have been a very tense and delicate situation. And who best to advise on how to deal with a tense and delicate local situation than the elders of the church that are there in that association, in that situation. And so they're going to advise Paul. I want you to remember, Paul is an apostle. Paul has authority. Paul could tell the elders what God would have people to do. And yet, when it comes down to a matter of judgment, even Paul is going to submit to the judgment of the elders in that local situation. I think that says something about the respect that we need to show toward the judgments that elders make. They don't make doctrine, but they have to judge on matters of expediency. And so they're going to advise the Apostle Paul. It says, they're informed of thee. In other words, listen, they've heard of you, and what they've heard hasn't been good. Said, they heard that thou teachest all the Jews that are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. Now, there's an element of truth in that, but this is not the way you say it. He wasn't telling them to forsake Moses. He was telling them this is the fulfillment of what Moses gave us. He wasn't telling them not to circumcise their children. That was their decision. In fact, he himself had circumcised Timothy, so that wasn't so. And he recognized that the Jews had different customs than the Gentiles. He did not require Gentiles to keep Jewish customs, but he would allow Jews to keep Jewish customs, as traditions, even though they're no longer under the law, that the roots of those customs often went back to the law. They're not under that law, but they can keep it as custom. And so they're perverting what Paul said. but this is again tense. And if people would exaggerate the problem of Paul if they wanted to cause problem for him. And so that's what they were doing here in Jerusalem. What is it therefore? So what are we going to do about this? He said, the multitudes must needs come together, for they'll hear that you're come. They're going to know you're here. And here's what they say. All right, we got Moses to add to our list of people here now. Here's what they say. Do this. Do therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Now, vows are not binding in New Testament law. But you would still, if you take a vow, you need to fulfill it. And they had taken a vow, and as you look at this, it sounds like a Nazirite vow, where you say, for this period of time, I'm not going to cut my hair. And then when it comes time for me to cut my hair, I'll go to the temple, and I will be shaven. And the other thing about this is that is somewhat perplexing. They would offer a sin offering in the temple. And that would have to be some money involved in this. So here's what those elders say. We've got 4 men that have a vow. Take them, purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they are informed concerning they are nothing, and that thou thyself walkest orderly and keepest the law. Now this is quite a dilemma. There's different opinions about this. Some say, Paul shouldn't have done this. Others say, oh yeah, I can defend everything Paul did. And then there's those like me to think, well, I just don't know about this. Some of this bothers me, that Paul would go to this extent in following law, even to the point of being at charges for a sin offering of a law that he had already preached and declared had been done away, and that the Jews were free from that law. And so this is quite a dilemma. In one of the commentaries that I read, it's one of the most perplexing episodes in the book of Acts. And I think I can agree with that. Well, as touching the Gentiles. Now, we're not going to let Gentiles do this. We understand this. The Gentiles don't have to follow the law. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. You forsake the sinful Gentile practices, but you're not under the law. Now, we understand that. But these are Jews in a period of transition, confronting something that is not going to even be an issue in a few years. So, Paul took them in. And the next day, purifying himself, and with them entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be made, or offering should be offered for every one of them. Okay, we've got Paul listed now among the people that are named in this account. And when 7 days were almost ended, the offerings were to be made at the end of the 7th day. It was suggested maybe God intervened in this time in a way that, in the way that God would do in an unseen way to prevent Paul from being part of the sin offering itself. Maybe that's so. But Paul was not part of that sin offering. That would be at the end of 7 days, and it wasn't quite time for the sin offering to be made. So when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, think Ephesus, okay? The main city of Asia. They had made their way to Jerusalem as well to take part of this feast. And these are the unbelieving Jews. The Jews which were of Asia, and they had caused Paul problems everywhere he went. And so now he's in Jerusalem with them, and they're going to cause problems for Paul there. When they saw him in the temple, they stirred up the people and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! help. This man teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks into the temple and have polluted this holy place. A couple of things. Some of those charges sound almost like the charges they had leveled against Stephen. You remember that? How he blasphemed Moses and the law and the temple, this holy place. Paul was among those that were involved in the stoning of Stephen when he was so charged. And here Paul is being charged with some of those same things that Stephen had been charged with. Well, quite a turn of events in the life of Paul, isn't it? Well, he said they polluted this holy place. They have found among the rubble of the stones that were left in Jerusalem at least 2 stones that mark a spot beyond which the Gentiles could not pass. When you think of the temple, don't think of a church building. Think of the temple grounds that had courts in them. And the large outer court was the court of the Gentiles. Coming in from the court of the Gentiles, that's as far as the Gentiles could go. And then there were these stones that say, you pass this point, and we're not responsible for what happens to you. We can put you to death. And the Romans had given the Jews permission to do that. And so there was that point at the end. Beyond that, then, you go to the court of the women. Not that it was reserved for women, but it was as far as women could go toward the most holy place. Beyond that was the court of Israel, where the Jewish men could go. And then the holy part of that where the priest could go, and then into the temple itself where the high priest could go. So there was kind of a hierarchy here, but it was that large outer court of the Gentiles. If you cross that line, you can be put to death. And so he said they have brought Greeks into the temple. They'd crossed that line. We mention Israel here. He's talking about the people of Israel and the place, Asia. That's where they were from, and they named one. For we have seen before with him in the city Trophimus and a Thesian. If you will remember, among the men that were going to accompany Paul from Corinth back to Jerusalem was going to be Trophimus. And evidently he'd made that journey, and Paul had been with him in the city, and so they supposed that Paul had brought Trophimus beyond that point at which the Gentiles could not cross. Well, all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. So if they were in that court of the women, they'd drag him out of that back into the court of and then shut the doors. See, they didn't want to shed blood on that holy ground. They didn't mind putting an innocent man to death, did they? But they didn't want to put him to death on these holy grounds, so they got him out of the court of women, shut the doors so they couldn't re-enter. We got Israel now and Trophimus mentioned. We've mentioned Ephesus. As they were about to kill him, tidings came to the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. You see, it was the Romans' job, and this chief captain, it was his job to make sure the peace was kept at Jerusalem. And so now word gets back, things are in an uproar in the temple. We're going to have to move and implement our anti-riot plans or whatever they had. So he immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left off beating Paul. Then the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains and demanded who he was and what he had done. That's what the prophet said. Remember when he'd taken that girdle, he said, you're going to be bound hand and foot. And now he's bound with the chains. And the immediate supposition, he must have done something because they're all in an uproar over Paul. Well, some cried one thing and some another. Does that remind you of something? It reminds me of the riot in Ephesus, where most of them didn't know why they'd come together. They were just shouting, "Great is the hand of the Ephesians," and didn't even know what they were rioting about. And they were crying one thing and then another. And now the Jews are doing the same thing in Jerusalem. One cried one thing, some another among the multitude, and he could not know the certainty of the tumult. He commanded him to be carried into the castle. I'll talk to you about that castle in just a moment. He couldn't settle it out there among that mob. They're going to drag him into the Roman castle that overlooks Jerusalem, where they could keep an eye on what was going on those temple grounds. And when he came upon the stairs, it was so that he was born of the soldiers for the violence of the people. He didn't walk to those stairs. Those Roman soldiers had to pick him up and carry him because the people were so violent, and they're keeping their prisoner, but they're also protecting him from the violent mob. And the multitude of the people followed after, crying. And what are they crying? "Away with him!" The very cry that they had cried toward Jesus when he was to be crucified. "Away with him! Away with him!" And now Paul is hearing that same cry in his ears. Now, I don't know that that picture's so good because the castle's kind of obscure there. I drew that yellow circle around it to help you see. And that is a model. That's not an actual building here. It's just a scale model of what that may have looked like. Something's wrong with that model because it doesn't show the steps, and the steps are very prominent. But it does show the way Josephus, except for those steps, the way the Jewish historian Josephus described that castle as a place where they could be upon those upper battlements and look and keep their eye on the temple grounds, where the Roman soldiers could be housed, and they would be ready at a moment's notice to rush into the temple grounds and to put down a riot just of the sort that was taking place here. So they carried him to the castle, and as Paul was being led into the castle, he said to the chief captain, "May I speak unto thee?" Who said, "Canst thou speak Greek?" Now, that's a little surprising. Just about everyone could speak Greek, but everyone couldn't speak Greek fluently. And Paul evidently had a Greek that was a very fluent Greek. You know, I know when people come to America and they speak English, and I can tell they're speaking English, but it's not the way we talk, is it? We can tell the difference. But Paul evidently spoke a Greek that showed he was no common man that was speaking Greek. He knew the Greek language well, and that surprised the chief captain. He said, "Art thou not that Egyptian, which before these days madest an uproar and leadest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers?" The murderers. There was a special word for those murderers. It was like a little terrorist group that was going on. Well, 4,000 wouldn't be so small, but they called them the assassins. And there was a Jewish Egyptian just a few years before that had over 1,000. Josephus says 3,000. The captain here says 4,000. So several thousands that had gathered on the Mount of Olives, intending to storm Jerusalem and take over, and then from that throw off the Romans. And they dispersed that, but they didn't catch the ringleader, that Egyptian Jew that had caused this problem. And so with this going on, the first thing that they probably had, you better watch out for this Egyptian. Might come to town and stir up trouble. And so he's thinking Paul might be this Egyptian that had returned. But Paul said, "I'm a man which am a Jew of Tarsus." Oh, I wish I had the map. Remember Egyptian to the south, Tarsus way to the north? He said, "A city of Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city." Paul, sometimes they say Paul had dual citizenship. Really, he had more than that. Paul was a citizen of the Jewish commonwealth. He was also a citizen of Tarsus, the city. But he was also a Roman citizen. And while the chief captain knew he was a citizen of Tarsus, he did not conclude yet that Paul was a Roman, as we'll see as we continue the story. We won't tonight, but we'll see that. But he said, a city of Tarsus, a citizen of no mean city. And I beseech thee, suffer me to speak to the people. And when he'd given him license, Paul stood on the stairs, got the attention, beckoned with his hand unto the people, and that mob grew silent. Paul standing there, having been beaten, bloodied, dirty, torn, with his clothes torn, having been carried by the Romans, going up those steps, and yet with great majesty, in that awful condition, he's able to beckon with his hand, and there's a bearing about him that caught those people's attention. Paul is risking his life on this occasion. His safety lay at the top of those stairs in that castle. But he loves his people. And here's his chance to preach to them. And so he's going to tell them and explain it to them. And they grew silent. It says, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, well, that's as far as we're going to get. Okay, it's kind of like those shows, to be continued. Okay, we're going to see what he says and what's going to happen to that when we gather again and study this the next time. That's as far as we're going to get. But he spake in the Hebrew tongue. So he knew his Greek, he knew his Hebrew. And these among the Hebrews, the Jews of Jerusalem, they would hear that familiar tongue and listen to what he is about to say. We've got Greece and Egypt and Tarsus and Cilicia to add to our places. And that brings this to an end. There's just so much there. And the background information is so important, isn't it? To understand the tensions, the emotions, the situations, the circumstance, and all this going on in the background that helps us appreciate what is taking place. And if we don't know that, what's taking place can really be confusing. And it's confusing enough anyway for me to see how he could offer those, be part of offering those sacrifices. Now that really does confuse me. But the point is, that's not even an issue today. If we never solve what the dilemma is about Paul being part of a sin offering for these men under a Nazirite vow, if we never figure that out, we can read the book of Hebrews. And we know what the book of Hebrews says, that the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. It's the blood of Christ. There must have been a period where God was allowing this transition to occur, but then that's going to end in just a few years. None of this would be an issue again. And neither is it an issue today. The way we're going to be saved is not by offering some lamb or goat or bull or some animal sacrifice. We're saved today by the blood of Jesus Christ. His shedding of that blood makes it possible for God to be both just and the justifier of sinners who believe in Jesus. And so that's what we encourage people to do. Come to the blood. The word's power in the blood. It empowers God to save. And we reach that blood when we're baptized into Christ. We're baptized, Paul says in Romans chapter 6, into his death. That's into the benefits that he secured for us by his death. I may not solve all of the riddles about everything that occurred in this account in the book of Acts, and I don't have to know what the gospel of Jesus Christ is and to know what my response needs to be to it. And so every time we gather together, we make an opportunity. If someone has been thinking, yeah, I need to do that, you have the opportunity. Don't let it go to waste. If you're ready tonight, we'll baptize you into Christ. You can come forward while we stand and sing.